Hey guys, tonight we travel to a world where snacks were soaked in ale, pies used questionable fillings, and the word crispy meant something very different, usually burnt. You're walking down a muddy, cobblestone alley in medieval England. It's damp, smells like wood smoke and wet wool, and from every crooked stall and greasy tent flap wafts a heavy aroma of meat, onions, and something sweet that might be fennel or might be rat. No judgment. The town market is bustling despite the drizzle. Chickens cluck freely between booths. A boy haggles over a hunk of cold, jellied pig trotter. And right next to you, a hunched vendor ladles steaming gravy over a trench of ale-soaked bread. Not soup. Bread. Soaked. In beer. Welcome to the deliciously questionable world of medieval junk food. You probably won't survive this, especially if you're gluten intolerant. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is. Curious minds want to know. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge past the fishmonger, his wares more smell than substance, and approach a man selling hot pies. He shouts the phrase as though it means something glorious. What's in them? You don't ask, because asking might involve eye contact, and eye contact leads to the truth. Still, curiosity wins. You get one. The crust is floury, the steam promising something. Inside, chopped eel, a few mystery herbs, and the unmistakable chew of gristle. A texture adventure. Eel, actually, was a favorite among the lower classes. Easily trapped in muddy streams, it didn't need preserving, just boiling or roasting. In some seasons, it was practically free. Imagine the medieval version of dollar menu fish tacos, only with more bones and less lime. Nearby, you spot something odd, small, dark loaves stacked in twos, topped with a smattering of onions and what appears to be curdled cheese. This is a form of pottage bread, or leftover stew scooped onto crusty loaves and reheated by fire, preferably the same fire used for everything else that day, including shoe repairs. That greasy crust might be lamb fat, or goose drippings, or, as one record hints darkly, beast marrow. And yet it smells kind of amazing. Hunger will do that. Historians still argue whether commoners ate better than we assume. Some accounts suggest a varied diet rich in seasonal produce, while others note that surviving primarily on bread, ale, and salted meat left many malnourished, especially when the bread was sometimes bulked out with chalk. Yes, chalk. And ale? Oh, you drank it all day? Even children. Not because people loved the buzz, though some certainly did, but because water was often deadly. Ale was brewed weak, like fizzy bread water, and drunk with everything from breakfast onions to dessert cheese. Your cup of medieval Pepsi, basically. At one crooked booth, a pair of children gnaw at skewers of roasted organ meat. A penny apiece. Gizzards, hearts, and occasionally kidneys, all slathered in thick brine to disguise their robust aroma. This wasn't delicacy, it was efficiency. Waste not, want not. Even the scraps had a second life. And yet, amid the gruel and goop, real ingenuity emerged. One old recipe tells of a meat coffin, a pie crust so thick it was more container than edible shell. Bakers loaded it with leftover pigeon, cabbage, and pepper, then sealed it shut like a Tupperware you could technically chew. The crust often doubled as a plate, though it was rarely eaten, unless you were desperate or a dog. Jokes aside, these street foods weren't merely survival rations. They were cultural glue. You'd gather by the pie cart after a long day shearing sheep, or grab a fried fish roll before an afternoon sermon. The food was hot, salty, and, most importantly, portable, but not without risks. One chronicler wrote of a man who died with sausage on the breath. Whether that meant choking, poisoning, or some grisly street brawl is up for interpretation. But we do know that meats were rarely refrigerated, spices were expensive, and ovens were communal. That's right, you didn't bake at home. You took your dough to the baker's oven, paid a small fee, and hoped he didn't swap your loaf for someone else's. He might even nibble the corner. Quality control, he'd claim. Let's not forget the surprise pies. These were meat pastries stuffed with whatever was left over from last week, game meat, root vegetables, or sometimes just lumps of gristle and a prayer. Often sold under dim torchlight. A strategic choice. Still hungry? A nearby woman hawks breed wine ale, literally bread soaked in beer. It's a simple dish, yes, but a deeply nostalgic one, especially for those without teeth. Soft, warm, and mildly intoxicating. Think of it like French toast without the eggs or ambition. And then, a showstopper, a steaming pan of buttered peas. They're not buttered. They're mashed with lard, seasoned with onion ash, and served with a wooden spoon. But they hit the spot. And in a world where hot food means luxury, that's what counts. Your feet ache. The market's begun to wind down. That last stall is already covering its meat pies with cloth. Well, cloth. You turn away, pocketing a chunk of cold, spiced bread for later. Maybe you'll feed it to a dog. Maybe you'll gnaw it during the night, when your stomach growls and the rats rustle near your sleeping mat. Either way, welcome to medieval junk food. Greasy, gritty, and weirdly charming. You may not crave it when you wake, but tonight, it lulls you deeper into that soft twilight hum of another time. You're still chewing on that spiced bread from earlier, though it's mostly gone cold and stiff as a plank. Now your path meanders into a quieter street, flanked by shuttered stalls and flickering torches. But there's one food cellar still open because sweets never sleep. A grinning merchant beckons you over, lifting the lid of a wooden box with theatrical flair. Inside, glossy strips of candied fennel, a few globs of what looks like hardened sap, and, wait, is that saffron? You're suspicious, and rightly so. In medieval Europe, sugar was a luxury product, imported at great cost and used sparingly, unless you were rich, in which case you drowned everything in it. But that didn't stop street vendors from mimicking sweet goods for the masses. Enter the age of sweet fakes. Candied fennel, for example, was sometimes boiled in honey, sometimes just smeared with a bit of musty syrup and left to dry in the sun. It wasn't exactly dessert, it was dental chaos on a stick. Yet it had a strange allure, especially when flavored with exotic spices that probably weren't what the label claimed. Saffron? That golden shimmer might be marigold. Historians still argue whether the average buyer could tell the difference, or if they even cared. The brighter and more dramatic the food looked, the more special it seemed. And in a world that lacked color and sparkle, your dinner was sometimes your only luxury. You pop a sugar almond into your mouth, sweet at first, then bitter, then suspiciously like soap. That's because many confections were sweetened with rosewater, sometimes thickened with egg whites or even powdered chalk. It was the era's equivalent of chemical additives, just convincing enough to pass, but not enough to sit well. Then comes the ultimate bait sandwich spices. True cinnamon, clove, nutmeg. These were gold-level imports, which meant fakes ran rampant. Vendors sold long pepper that was just dried tree bark. You'd sprinkle it on your gruel and pretend you were rich, even if the aftertaste lingered like burnt parchment. Still, people loved it. Because sweets weren't just for taste, they were status, superstition, and pseudo-medicine. A candied anise seed wasn't just a treat. It could settle the humors, ward off evil, and maybe freshen your breath. In theory. And sugar? Oh, that was the ultimate flex. Nobles would eat sugar sculptures at feasts, giant castles or animals made entirely from pressed sugar paste, decorated with gold leaf. You get a lumpy walnut dipped in molasses, sold from a cart that probably also doubles as a pig feeding trough. Don't feel bad. Even kings had to ration their imports. And there was plenty of trickery at the top. Some medieval sweetmeats were more visual than edible. Imagine biting into a glossy tart only to find it's filled with dyed lard, or taking a sip of a syrup that turns out to be fermented prune water. One chronicler called it diabolical nectar. You wander further and find a friar seated on a bench, calmly sucking on what looks like a sugar stick. He nods, offers you one, and explains that it's a sweet of the saints, a mixture of herbs, honey, and crushed almonds, wrapped in linen. It was supposed to help with sin, or digestion, or both. Who can say? The friar shrugs. Tastes like penance, he chuckles, and goes back to munching. Later, you pass a nobleman's home just as the kitchen doors open for air. The scent hits you first: sugar, meat, and something floral. The cooks have been preparing subtleties, elaborate centerpieces for an upcoming feast. These were edible illusions: peacocks with sugar feathers, ships made of pastry, pies that sang when opened. Okay, not really sang. More like expelled steam and the occasional startled pigeon. Yes, They actually put live birds in pies. That's where the nursery rhyme comes from. You'd slice into the crust, and out would fly a flock of doves, terrifying your guests and delighting the host. Culinary theater. The food itself? Often barely seasoned and mostly cold. Of course, sweets had their dark side. The obsession with sugar was seen by some clerics as indulgent, even sinful. Monks were warned against hoarding candied nuts. One abbot wrote of a brother who sought the sugar pot more than the psalms. Scandalous. And let's not forget dental consequences. By the late medieval period, tooth decay was rampant among the elite. Their love of sugar and lack of toothbrushes left many with blackened stumps for teeth. It's no surprise that portraits were painted tight-lipped. Smile, and your molars might crumble mid-pose. But again, sweets weren't just luxury, they were medicine. Or so people thought. Apothecaries sold sugar lozenges for sore throats, honey pills for digestion, and even sugar-coated wormwood to combat female hysteria. Was any of it effective? Well, some herbs probably helped a little. But mostly, you just got sticky and slightly buzzed. Back in the market, a boy runs past you, grinning, holding a sticky slab of what might be leche lumbered, a sort of medieval nougat. It contains almonds, honey, and possibly chicken fat. No one knows why. Historians still debate the authenticity of certain recipes, with some claiming these sweets were common and others arguing they were rare feasting fare. The truth? Probably both, depending on how desperate your village baker was. Finally, you pause by a stall selling jumbles, twisted rings of dough flavored with anise or caraway, baked hard and meant to last for weeks. Medieval hard candy, in a way. Satisfying, mildly sweet, and jaw-breakingly solid. You pocket one. Maybe you'll gnaw on it later. Or use it as a weapon. Either way, it's a taste of an age where sugar was precious, sweets were sometimes lies, and dessert could be as dangerous as battle. Your feet drag a little as you turn into another alley, drawn by a light sizzling sound and the unmistakable aroma of something frying or burning. It's hard to tell. You follow the scent to a cluster of wooden stalls tucked beneath a row of crooked beams. A dingy cloth sign flaps limply above one. Cookshop painted in wobbly red ink. It's not so much a name as a warning. You step in, and your senses are assaulted. The air is thick with grease, smoke, and the ghost of onions past. A large cauldron bubbles ominously in the back, its contents indeterminate but definitely meat-adjacent. Wooden spoons poke from the edges of open pans, flies circle lazily overhead, and a boy with a greasy apron wipes his hands on a cloth that may once have been white but now resembles old jerky. This is a medieval cookshop, a sort of proto-fast food joint where meals were quick, hot, and terrifying. Here, the poor bought cooked food because they couldn't afford their own hearth. Or pots. Or really, time. And the vendors? They operated out of tiny, smoke-choked kitchens with very little regulation and even less scrubbing. Health codes wouldn't arrive for another 600 years. You take a seat, really more of a tilted bench, and examine your options. A steaming bowl of pottage. A slab of meat so dark it could be burnt bark. Something with lentils, you think. Maybe peas. Maybe pebbles. You point at the least suspicious one, and the vendor nods, ladling it into a cracked wooden bowl. The taste? It's warm. Slightly sour. Possibly cabbage. Definitely salt. But it's filling. And crucially, it's not raw. Now here's where it gets interesting. Most cookshops didn't clean their pans between dishes. In fact, many prided themselves on the layered seasoning built up over weeks, sometimes months of constant cooking. Think of it like a never-ending stew, each meal inheriting flavors and bacteria from the last. Your lentils might be mingling with last week's eel and someone spilled ale from Tuesday. Historians still argue whether this style of rolling stew was a method of flavor enhancement or just laziness. Some claim it created richer dishes over time. Others suggest it's why food poisoning was so common you didn't even bother complaining. And don't even ask about the utensils. Most diners brought their own. The few who didn't got a communal spoon, which was dunked in a wash bucket between uses. Wash bucket is a generous term. It was more of a tepid puddle with floaties. The real flavor came from sharing. A side effect of all this? You get to know your neighbors. Cookshops were social hubs. You'd eat elbow to elbow with strangers, swapping gossip, insults, or bones. And if someone stole your bowl? Too bad. Bring a backup next time. There's a woman across from you, digging into something gray and glistening. She sees your expression and chuckles. "Turnip mash," she says proudly, "with marrow fat." You smile politely, then politely return your eyes to the wall, where a dried sausage hangs on a nail like a festive decoration. It might be weeks old. Still edible. Mostly. In fact, meat in cookshops was usually old, tough, and boiled into oblivion. Sausages were more about preservation than taste, and spicing them was a high art or high fraud. Vendors often ground up every leftover scrap of meat, bread, and sometimes animal organs, then crammed it into intestines and hung it up until it stopped moving. Seasoned with pepper or ash, or just salt and hope. One cookshop you pass advertises chicken stew. Sounds like chicken, right? But the spelling is vague and the meat has 4 legs. You don't ask. The vendor grins too much for comfort. Some brave souls, especially students and laborers, lived almost entirely on cookshop fare. You'd get your daily pottage, maybe a boiled dumpling or two, and wash it all down with cheap ale or small beer. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner, all from the same pan. That same ladle. That same bucket. Deliciously monotonous. But these stalls weren't just grim, they were also resourceful. One vendor might offer a pie made from yesterday's stew, wrapped in barley dough and grilled on a flat stone. Another might stuff hollowed turnips with spiced beans and call it noble fare. There's charm in the scrappiness. Waste not, want not. Unless it's that thing in the corner, which may be moving on its own. Remember the street cheese from earlier? It's here, sitting in a tray by the hearth, slowly weeping. It smells like bravery. Or a dare. Either way, the cook is saving it for someone with nothing left to lose. And oh, the fire hazard. With so many cookshops crammed together, and everyone cooking with open flames and grease, entire streets could vanish in a single spark. Fire codes? Cute. The best defense was a bucket of water, if you had one. Otherwise, you hoped the neighbor's house was wetter than yours. Still, for all the grime and risk, cookshops provided something vital: access. If you were poor, tired, or simply hungry, they gave you a warm bowl and a place to sit. Maybe a chat with an old woman who remembered when beef actually meant cow. Maybe a riddle from a jester eating pickled eggs with his fingers. Maybe food that wouldn't kill you. Probably. You finish your bowl, scrape the last gooey bit from the side, and return it to the vendor. He grunts approvingly and hands you a lump of bread, stale but solid. That's your dessert. You step back out into the night, full, not satisfied, exactly, but warm. The cookshop smoke clings to your cloak. Your stomach rumbles softly. It's unclear whether that's a good sign. Still, the glow of the fire fades behind you, and you realize that slightly sour taste in your mouth? It's kind of growing on you. Or possibly growing in you. The night presses in deeper, and with your belly reluctantly full of whatever that was, you stroll past rows of dark windows, lanterns swaying like sleepy fireflies. But as you round a corner, you spot something a bit more inviting. A cluster of vendors gathered around an open-air table, lit by oil lamps and the faint orange glow of embers. It smells sweet, and tangy, and unmistakably fried. Welcome to the medieval fairground snack zone, except there's no roller coaster, no plastic cups, and absolutely no hygiene. But there is food on sticks, and that's almost the same thing. The first stall you approach is run by a large man with soot-smudged cheeks, holding a tray of what looks like doughy spheres, lightly browned and steaming. You take one and bite in cautiously. It's hot, slightly oily, and oddly delightful. Fritter, the medieval equivalent of the donut hole. Though unlike anything you'd recognize from a box of modern donuts, this is a lumpy ball of mashed peas, onion, and sometimes a bit of fish, all fried together in animal fat. Dessert? Nope. Snack? Sort of. Mystery? Always. Fritters were the reigning monarchs of junk food, endlessly customizable and perfect for disguising questionable ingredients. Have some apples that are going bad. Slice and fry them in batter. Leftover eel? Dice it and drop it into a sizzling pot. No one asks questions after the first crunch. And yes, they did sweet fritters too, especially around religious festivals. You'd get bits of bread dipped in honey, fried until golden and dusted with sugar, if you were lucky. If not, it was molasses or a scrap of dried fig stirred into the batter to give it a festive air. Historians still argue whether these treats were meant to actually taste good, or just keep peasants distracted between sermons. Speaking of distractions, One vendor waves you over to what looks like a crude skewer stand. He rotates something long and dark over a pit of glowing coals. You squint. Is that a sausage? A rat? A rat sausage? Nope, it's black pudding. A dense, coagulated mixture of blood, oats, and fat, sometimes flavored with onions or herbs, depending on the region. It's considered a delicacy in some circles, a tragedy in others. You take a small nibble, and your tongue rebels instantly. It tastes like old pennies and ambition. Still, it's protein. And it lasts. Black pudding was one of those handy foods you could cook ahead of time, carry in a pouch, and nibble throughout the day, assuming you didn't mind that lingering iron tang in your mouth. Then you spot something more familiar, or so you think. A thin slab of golden dough, bubbling slightly at the edges, dusted with what looks like herbs and possibly cheese. It's pizza, right? You're halfway to asking for a slice before you remember. Tomatoes don't exist here yet. Neither does mozzarella. What you're staring at is a fladen, a flatbread topped with onion, leeks, and maybe a sprinkle of rancid goat cheese, if the vendor's feeling generous. And while it looks like something you might order with a soda today, it's really more of a hot vegetable cracker with abandonment issues. Still, you fold a slice and take a bite. It's okay. Chewy, a bit salty, with a strong onion kick that'll haunt your breath until at least next Sunday. Probably longer. Further down the row, you find a man selling cakes. You get excited, until he hands you a slice that weighs more than a brick and smells faintly like hay. Turns out, medieval cakes weren't always sweet. Sometimes they were barley loaves mixed with mashed beans or lentils and baked until firm. Think of it as an edible doorstop. Or don't. But not all was bleak. There were spiced nuts, roasted in pans with honey and a touch of pepper, then sold in small cloth cones. Sticky, fragrant, and dangerously addictive. You find yourself buying a second batch before you finish the first. And let's not forget the ever-popular chewits. These were tiny pastry pockets stuffed with minced meat or fish, occasionally dried fruit, and fried until crispy. They were the pasty's chaotic little cousin. Easy to carry, easier to burn your tongue on, and completely unreliable in terms of what you might find inside. You pause as a drunk man next to you bites into one and mutters, "Mutton, I think. Or pigeon. Or both." Then he hiccups and walks off, chewing thoughtfully. In the back of this noisy little gathering, a woman stirs a vat of something syrupy, glossy, and suspiciously thick. She offers you a wooden spoonful. It's meat candy, reduced honey wine boiled down with herbs until it forms sticky strands. Medieval taffy. You lick your lips. Sweet. Warming. Slightly herbal, like chewing on a spiced candle. By now, your hands are sticky, your breath smells like three kingdoms collided, and you've consumed more fried dough than seems advisable. But there's one last item you must try. A local specialty. The vendor calls it hedgehog pie. You raise an eyebrow. He laughs. No hedgehogs. Just a name. He's lying. Or at least, stretching the truth. Hedgehog pie was a real dish in some rural parts of medieval Europe, though often the name referred to the shape rather than the ingredients. They'd shape the pastry into a spiky dome, usually filled with root vegetables or small game, and sometimes prickled with almond slivers for quills. Cute? Yes. Tasty? Occasionally. You try a bite. It's warm. Nutty. Heavy on the parsnip. You tell yourself it's not hedgehog. You don't ask again. By now, the vendors are packing up, scraping pans, and dousing fires. The fairground fades into quiet shadows, and you're left with sticky fingers, a full stomach, and a head full of weirdly cozy memories. You didn't get popcorn or churros, but you did survive medieval snack time. Barely. The cobbled path winds into a quieter quarter now, your steps echoing against stone as you meander past wooden shutters, and a cold breeze nudges the last traces of fried onions from your cloak. You're not hungry anymore. Well, not in the traditional sense, but your curiosity isn't quite full. Because while you sampled the hot, bubbling chaos of medieval cookshops and fairground stalls, there's another kind of food that defined this era's diet: the dried, the preserved, and the downright eternal. You enter a small courtyard, half lit by a guttering torch, where an old man is carefully arranging slices of something on a woven rack. He barely looks up as you approach. "Dried pear," he says simply. "From last year." "Ah yes, preserved food, the unsung hero of survival in the Middle Ages." It may not sparkle like roast goose or tempt like a sweet fritter, but when winter sinks its teeth in, you'll be grateful for every hard biscuit and shriveled plum. The dried pear he offers is leathery, slightly chewy, with a flavor like sweetened tree bark. But it's real. It keeps for months, even years if you do it right. And it reminds you just how clever folks had to be when fresh wasn't an option. Medieval preservation methods were creative, if not always appetizing. Drying was most common. Apples sliced thin and hung in the rafters, herbs bunched like garlands in every cottage beam, mushrooms left out in the sun until they crinkled into tiny forest fossils. Then there was salting, less of a culinary choice, more of a necessity. Meat? Salt it. Fish? Salt it. Cheese? Salt the daylights out of it and hope it survives the trip inland. A salted herring might travel for hundreds of miles, tough as rope and twice as chewy. But if you were lucky enough to find water to soften it in, dinner was saved. Historians still argue whether salted cod or stockfish was genuinely considered a delicacy or simply endured with the same grim determination that peasants applied to plague outbreaks. Either way, it was everywhere. Stiff, pale, and smelling like a ship's bilge. Yum. You pass a shed where bundles of dried herbs hang from pegs. Sage, rosemary, thyme. Not just flavoring, but medicine. Preservation wasn't just about food, it was about stretching resources, protecting health, and staying 2 steps ahead of starvation. In a nearby alcove, a woman stirs a thick paste in a pot beside a stack of small glass jars. Quince paste, she tells you. Made by boiling down the fruit with honey or sugar until it forms a sliceable jelly, then storing it in jars sealed with wax. It was one of the few ways to make fruit last without drying or rotting. You nibble a corner. It's tart, fragrant, and just sweet enough to chase the lingering salt of that last piece of cod from your teeth. Not all preservation involved taste, though. Sometimes it was pure defense against decay. Take hardtack, for example, those infamous bricks of baked flour and water, designed to last years. Soldiers carried them. Sailors gnawed on them. You could hammer a nail with one, then eat it with soup. If you had soup, you hold a piece now, testing its heft. It could knock out a cow. You take a bite anyway, and your teeth protest. It's like chewing a ceiling tile. A stale ceiling tile, but it fills you. Eventually, there's a kind of poetry in this food. It's not glamorous, but it's stubborn, enduring. These were the backup plans of a world where famines came in cycles and markets closed for snow, or war, or plague. They were security, tucked away in barrels, pots, sacks, and cellars. You glance up at the nearest cottage roof, where garlic braids dangle like medieval tinsel. Cloves against vampires? Sure, but also against starvation. Garlic kept well, repelled pests, and flavored even the blandest grain mush into something borderline tasty. Grain, by the way, was often dried and ground into flour, or meal, as they called it. Stored in wooden barrels, it could keep for months unless the mice got there first. Sometimes it was mixed with dried peas or beans to stretch it further. Other times, ground acorns or chestnuts were added, if you didn't mind the occasional bitterness. Or hallucinations. Fun fact, improperly processed acorns contain toxins. Guess how they learned that? To store liquid ingredients, people turned to pickling. Not just cucumbers, but just about everything. Onions, eggs, cabbage, even tiny fish. Soaked in vinegar or brine, these sour little relics could survive well into the new year and beyond. You try a pickled plum and immediately regret it. The sour hits first, then the salt, then a strange medicinal aftertaste. A flavor roller coaster, and not the fun kind. Still, there's one method of preservation that towers above the rest in terms of cultural importance: smoking. Meat, fish, cheese, even fruit, on occasion, could be suspended above a low fire and slowly dried with fragrant wood smoke. It kept out bacteria and kept in flavor. The result? Something firm, flavorful, and oddly festive. Like a jerky, but medieval. You're offered a sliver of smoked mutton and chew carefully. It's tough, chewy, and somehow nostalgic. Like eating a memory of dinner. But preservation wasn't just practical, it was deeply seasonal. Autumn was all about storing up, drying, pickling, salting, jarring. Entire villages turned into pop-up preservation factories. Children gathered herbs. Women tended fires. Men dragged barrels of fish to the smokehouse. Everyone knew, if you didn't prep in fall, you'd suffer in February. Of course, not all preserved foods were equal. Nobles had better cellars, tighter seals, imported spices, and more sugar, if they could afford it. The poor? They had cleverness and a tolerance for texture. There's a final treat offered to you as the night deepens, a dried plum wrapped in parchment and tied with string. It's leathery, sweet, a little bitter on the finish, but satisfying. It survived a long journey, and so have you. As you bite down, you wonder, will your stomach survive all these ancient experiments? Maybe, maybe not. But at least you've tasted a piece of time, or several pieces, all at once. You wander into a dimmer alley now, where the stone walls sweat with nighttime damp, and the wind curls through narrow gaps like a whispering ghost. Your stomach groans, not with hunger exactly, but with the general protest of someone who's had too many fritters, one suspicious plum, and at least one bite of history that shouldn't have been chewed. Still, something else now tugs at your curiosity: beverages. What did medieval folks wash all this culinary creativity down with? The answer: a surprisingly large and occasionally dangerous variety of drinks. Let's start with water. Simple, refreshing, life-sustaining, and absolutely not to be trusted. In the Middle Ages, water was often feared more than famine. It ran foul through ditches, picked up all manner of plague and parasite, and could turn even the healthiest monk into a footnote in the local monastery records. Unless you lived near a natural spring or had access to a deep, clean well, chances are you didn't drink water. At least, not unboiled. Instead, everyone turned to ale. Not beer, at least not how you'd recognize it. Medieval ale was brewed with water, malted barley, and sometimes herbs like crude instead of hops. It was low in alcohol, more like boozy bread juice than a pub pint, but it was safer to drink than water and full of calories. You weren't just hydrating. You were snacking in liquid form. Children drank ale. Monks brewed it. Peasants sipped it with breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Sometimes even breakfast part two. It was the original smoothie, just a bit frothier and more likely to knock you sideways if you downed it too fast. You stop at a tavern now, its wooden sign creaking above the door, and inside, a low fire glows. A woman behind the counter pours you a wooden cup of what she calls small beer. It's sour, warm, and smells like damp bread crusts. You take a sip. It's not horrible, but also not great. More a background beverage than a star of the show. Then there's mead, the elegant older cousin of ale. Made from fermented honey, mead had a reputation for sophistication. It was sweet, warming, and often flavored with herbs or spices. You sip a sample handed to you by a sleepy-eyed bard, and it slides across your tongue like liquid gold laced with rosemary and a whisper of apples. Mead wasn't just a beverage. It was a status symbol, a poetic muse, and occasionally a medicine. If ale was the muddy stream of daily life, mead was the glimmering pond you only visited on feast days or when a visiting noble wandered into town. Historians still argue whether mead was as widely consumed as legend suggests, or whether it was more ceremonial, saved for weddings, midwinter feasts, or that one guy in the village who insisted on reciting long poems about dragons. Either way, it was adored and preserved in song. Further into the tavern, a hunch brewer pulls out something stranger: posset. It's warm milk curdled with ale or wine, spiced with ginger and clove, and served in what looks like a glorified soup bowl. You wrinkle your nose. It's like pudding that gave up halfway through its career. You sip it anyway. It's oddly comforting, like a medieval version of NyQuil, minus the cherry flavor. Milk, by the way, was for the young or the sick. Fresh milk soured quickly, especially in the absence of refrigeration. So it was either drunk straight from the animal in early morning, warm and frothy, or turned into something more stable: butter, cheese, or that aforementioned posset. If you were caught drinking a lot of fresh milk as an adult, people might assume you were either wealthy enough to afford cows or unlucky enough to be recovering from dysentery. Now, if you were fancy or lucky, you might get a sip of imported wine. Yes, even in medieval Europe, wine flowed, but not as smoothly as you might think. It was largely a southern delicacy: France, Italy, Spain. If you lived up north, like in England or Scandinavia, wine was rare and expensive, often reserved for the church or very rich tables. The wine itself? Probably a bit sour, often watered down, and stored in barrels that may or may not have previously held fish. Still, it had prestige. You watch as a well-dressed merchant dips his fingers into a goblet, sniffs it with exaggerated flair, then sneezes violently from the vinegar sharpness. Good vintage, he lies. Meanwhile, you try something called cider fermented apple juice. Sharp, fizzy, and deeply tied to local harvests, it was the darling of many villages, especially in orchard-rich regions. Unlike ale, cider had a pleasant tang, and it didn't require grain, which meant fewer arguments with the bread makers. Fermentation was, in many ways, the answer to survival. It made drinks safer, longer-lasting, and occasionally festive. You didn't need refrigeration when you had patience and a cellar. Just don't mention the exploding barrels, those happened. Fermentation, after all, isn't always polite. Herbal infusions also made the rounds. Not quite tea, no real tea leaves yet, but close cousins. Boiled water poured over mint, sage, chamomile, or whatever plants were nearby. Sometimes sweetened with honey, other times mixed with vinegar in a tangy drink known as oxymel. Supposedly medicinal, possibly torturous. You sip one, your eyebrows climb in protest. It's like hot salad dressing. Still, some brews were genuinely pleasant. Elderflower cordial, fermented berry drinks, even rosewater mixed with almond milk on occasion, if you were wealthy and feeling poetic. One scribe even wrote about sipping spiced wine so fragrant, he dreamt of gardens in Byzantium. That might have been the alcohol talking, but still, points for effort. There's one last mystery drink set before you tonight. A cloudy, thick mug labeled Braggot. A cross between mead and ale, brewed with both honey and malt. It's a Frankenstein's monster of medieval drinking, and it tastes like a bar brawl between a loaf of rye bread and a bouquet of herbs. You like it. You're not sure why. By now, your belly sloshes with history's happy hour. Every sip, a tale. Every flavor, a lesson in survival, pleasure, and the creativity required when clean water was a gamble. You stagger out of the tavern, not drunk, but comfortably woozy. The sky is darker now. The stars blink down like watchful gods. And you wonder, how did anyone get anything done in a world where half the population was mildly buzzed by lunchtime? But then again, maybe that's the secret. Maybe they got just enough ale in their system to forget the rats, the taxes, and the plague and focus on the important stuff, like inventing fried cheese. You sway slightly as you walk, not from the ale, you tell yourself, but from the cobbles, which seem less even than they were an hour ago. Or perhaps it's just the mild time travel fatigue of having sampled every weird, warm, and wine-spiked liquid of medieval life. Either way, you press on. Because tonight's journey isn't just about food and drink, it's about how people got it. And so your path now takes you to the tangled heart of a medieval market. It's morning now, or close enough. The sky is a pale gray soup, and stalls begin to emerge from the mist like mushrooms after rain. You hear them before you see them. Carts creaking, vendors barking, chickens clucking as if they're offended by the price of grain. Welcome to the medieval grocery run. No baskets, no coupons, just chaos. You squeeze into a busy square, where row after row of wooden stalls cluster around an open patch of trampled mud. Barrels leak. Baskets overflow. Someone's selling onions. Someone else is selling, possibly not onions. You pass a woman whose table is a masterpiece of decay, bruised apples, wilted greens, something that might have been a parsnip in a better life. Still, she waves you over with cheer. This is a good day. You're drawn first to the fishmonger. Always a gamble. The air is thick with brine and suspicion. He has eels. Lots of eels. Fat ones, skinny ones, some still twitching in a bucket. Smoked herring hangs like laundry behind him, each one a gray ribbon of preserved protein. You're offered a free sniff. You decline. Fish was a medieval staple, especially in Catholic regions where fish days were mandatory. No meat allowed, which meant the demand for aquatic food skyrocketed, even in places hundreds of miles from the coast. Enter the salted, dried, and frankly terrifying codfish. Stockfish, they called it. You could build a house with these things. The market, of course, is segregated by type. You drift toward the produce area. Bunches of leeks, carrots with frilly tops, cabbages the size of cauldrons. And yet no potatoes. Not yet. That humble spud wouldn't arrive until centuries later, courtesy of the Americas. For now, it's all roots and leaves, and the occasional worm, if you're lucky. A child offers you a bunch of wild garlic, grinning with all three of his teeth. His basket also holds foraged mushrooms, tiny pears, and something lumpy wrapped in a cabbage leaf. He calls it cheese, but you're skeptical. Speaking of cheese, yes, it's here. Wheels of hard, aged varieties stacked like medieval frisbees. Cheese was a key way to preserve milk and also disguise its spoilage. Sharp, salty, occasionally moldy in a way that might get you canceled today. Still, you nibble a corner. It's assertive. A cheese with opinions. Nearby, the bread vendor is doing brisk business. Loaves of coarse rye, dark wheat, and barley bread. No fluffy white stuff unless you're nobility or you work in a monastery with a generous budget. Most folks got maslin, a mixture of whatever grains they had on hand, often rough and dense enough to chip a molar. You have to loaf. It's heavy, potentially lethal if thrown, but filling. And with a smear of lard or a sprinkle of dried herbs, it becomes dinner, or breakfast, or both. Historians still argue whether medieval bread was truly bad or just different. Some say it was so packed with fiber and grit that it caused dental erosion. Others point out that it was crucial nutrition, especially when meat was scarce. Either way, your jaw is getting a workout. In the center of the square stands the meat seller. His wares are hung from hooks, rabbits, ducks, sides of mutton. Some still drip. You watch a woman haggle over a pig's head. She wins, walks away triumphant, and you suddenly remember that every part of the animal was used. Nose to tail, nothing wasted. Ears were fried. Feet were pickled. Even blood became pudding. A butcher sharpens his knife with the calm detachment of someone who's done this 1,000 times. He offers you a sausage, dense, smoky, probably containing things you don't want to ask about. You accept. It's delicious. You try not to think too hard. At the market's edge, a traveling spice merchant unrolls a leather pouch filled with tiny packets of powdered mystery. Saffron, cinnamon, cloves. These aren't just flavorings, they're luxury goods. Spices came from faraway lands, costing fortunes in silver, silk, or promises. A pinch of nutmeg could buy you a goose. A whole bag? A noble's ransom. He lets you smell something called long pepper, hotter than black pepper, oddly floral. You sneeze explosively, and he chuckles. First one's free, he says. Then there's the egg seller, who swears her hens lay better-tasting yolks during full moons. The alewife, who's already opened her first cask and is sipping merrily from a tankard the size of her head. The baker's boy, delivering trays of flatbread to a tavern with alarming speed and even more alarming sneezing fits. Everything about this market hums with urgency. Medieval food shopping wasn't a leisurely scroll through online apps. It was a daily quest. Food spoiled quickly. Supply changed by the hour. Prices swung like a mace depending on harvests, weather, or whether a passing noble decided to tax flour for fun that week. And yet, there's community here. Gossip buzzes. Jokes are exchanged over turnip bundles. A man selling honeycomb sings a tune about a lusty widow and her radish patch. No one bats an eye. The food is imperfect, yes. Sometimes suspicious. Occasionally wriggling. But it's alive. Real. Bought with haggled coin. Baked with soot-blackened hands. Spiced with whatever you could afford. You step away from the market now, your cloak dusted with flour and your pockets jingling with crumbs. And you realize something. In the Middle Ages, food wasn't just about taste. It was about timing, survival, and a touch of luck. A good loaf, a decent piece of fish, and maybe, just maybe, a sweet plum or two. And you? You made it through the chaos without getting pickpocketed by a goat. That's a win. You leave the marketplace behind. Ears still ringing from the shouting vendors, nose tingling with a blend of fish brine and singed barley. But don't get too comfortable yet. If you think medieval food was only about ingredients and vendors, think again. Tonight, you step into the kitchens, the steamy, smoky, utterly chaotic heart of how food actually got made. Welcome to the back end of medieval cooking. First thing to realize, kitchens in the Middle Ages weren't cozy. They were battlefield zones. Fire everywhere, soot on every surface, and knives, so many knives. You duck under a low lintel and emerge into one now. A manor house kitchen, where 5 cooks are barking orders. A pig is rotating over the fire like some medieval disco ball, and an apprentice is weeping into a pot of parsnip soup. The room is lit by the open hearth, No ovens as we know them, just fire pits and clay ovens built into the walls. Cauldrons hang from blackened hooks. Flames lick at everything. The air is thick with fat and flour and barely suppressed panic. You're handed a spoon and told to stir the fermenty. You nod like you know what that is. Fermenty, as it turns out, is boiled wheat porridge. Sometimes flavored with milk, sometimes with meat stock, and sometimes with saffron and dried fruit. Kind of like risotto that can't decide if it's sweet or savory. You taste it. It's surprisingly comforting, in a this used to be bird food kind of way. Medieval cooking wasn't just about sustenance. In wealthier households and religious institutions, it was theater. Every meal had layers, literally. Cooks built pies that revealed live birds when sliced. They dyed jellies to look like stained glass. They made peacocks into dinner centerpieces, feathers reattached after roasting for dramatic effect. Yes, really. Historians still argue whether these elaborate dishes were widely enjoyed or simply absurd pageantry for showy banquets. And then there's the spice cupboard, or rather, the locked wooden box in the head cook's quarters. Spices were precious, rationed, and heavily guarded. A sprinkle of cinnamon, luxury. A few grains of pepper, Fort Knox-level access. If you dared to overuse saffron, you'd be excommunicated from the kitchen and possibly pelted with stale crusts. In less glamorous homes, say, the average peasant's hut, cooking was done over an open flame or with hot stones. You walk into one now. A low ceiling, a smoky fire pit, and a pot perpetually simmering with whatever could be foraged, stolen, or kindly traded. Cabbage, leeks, a chunk of bacon if it's a holiday. The smell is earthy, like damp wood and resolve. You're served a ladle of pottage, a kind of never-ending soup that gets topped up daily. It's hearty, and possibly from Thursday. Peasants didn't have recipe books. They had instincts. A pinch of dried herbs. A stone to stir with. A wooden spoon passed down like an heirloom. No timers. No thermometers. Just experience and a stubborn sense of taste. You notice the tools, too. Wooden ladles, stone mortars, iron spits, and baskets woven so tightly they could carry broth. Everything's handmade, reused, repurposed. There's something poetic about it, until a chicken walks straight through the hearth ashes and steals half a turnip from the counter. One apprentice is making trencher bread. Remember that from earlier? Thick slabs of stale bread used as plates. After the meal, these weren't thrown away. They soaked up juices and sauces and were then eaten, fed to the poor, or given to dogs. You poke one. It's like a sponge made of sorrow. In a castle kitchen, things get fancier. You enter one now, following a line of sweating kitchen boys carrying platters like they're smuggling gold. There's a pastry cook sculpting a pie into the shape of a deer. Another is roasting swan, feathers to be reapplied later. The head cook barks instructions using phrases like, "Blanch the warden pears," and "Has the boar's head been larded yet?" Everything is timed with the precision of a military drill. Meals had multiple courses. Not one dish per person, but whole themes. Sweet, savory, cold, warm, meat, fish, sauces, jellies, candied almonds, and whatever dessert they could dream up involving rosewater and hardened sugar. Sugar, by the way, was a latecomer and another luxury. You'd find it only in wealthy kitchens, and even then, in small, jewel-like doses. Honey was far more common, slathered on roasts, used in mead, and stirred into medicine. Sweetness was power, and those who had it flaunted it. One odd scene catches your eye. A cook peeling almonds by hand to make almond milk. Yes, before it was trendy and overpriced, almond milk was a medieval kitchen staple, especially useful on fasting days when dairy was forbidden. They'd grind the almonds, mix them with water, strain it, and use it in stews, pastries, even sauces for fish. You try a sip. It's gritty and mild, like watery nut butter. Still better than the eel jelly from 2 hours ago. And what about baking? Ah yes, the bread ovens. You peek into one, where massive loaves rise slowly in radiant heat. Baking was an art. Village ovens were communal. You'd pay a fee to the oven keeper, who'd let you slot in your dough when the time was right. No peeking. No second chances. You either got bread or bricks. Here's the quirky part. There were actual laws controlling bread quality. In some towns, bakers could be fined or pilloried for selling underweight loaves. In extreme cases, they were made to eat their own bad bread in public. You imagine that punishment today. You call this a ciabatta? Back in the manor, the meal is nearly ready. Kitchen staff line up trays, inspect garnishes, and panic over presentation. You watch as a young boy drops a quail into a dish of syrup. The head cook glares but says nothing. There's no time. You glance around. Smoke clings to the walls like grease. The scent of sage and roast duck hangs in the rafters. Someone is carving sugar into a swan. Another is drying herbs by the window. A cat steals a sausage and sprints under a table. No one even blinks. This, you realize, is the real story of medieval food, not just what people ate, but how they transformed chaos into comfort, turned raw scraps into celebration, and did it all over open fire with nothing but a wooden spoon and a lot of hope. As you leave, your cloak smelling like every kitchen in Europe, you can't help but marvel. Not at the dishes themselves, but at the sheer nerve it took to make them. You wander away from the kitchen, blinking through tendrils of wood smoke and the echoes of clattering pots. But there's no rest yet, not for your imagination, not for your travel-weary slippers. Because now, we're heading somewhere truly odd. Somewhere the modern concept of snack goes to die, only to be reborn in curdled milk and candied seeds. Tonight, you're sampling the realm of medieval junk food. Yes, junk food. Not fries and fizzy drinks, but the strange, the sweet, and the suspiciously deep-fried cravings of the past. And as you round the bend of a cobbled lane, you spot a wooden cart, its wheels rickety, its proprietor grinning. His stall is a glorified crate with a canopy, and it smells like burnt sugar, roast chestnuts, and desperation. He gestures toward his offerings, honey fritters sprinkled with a dusting of spice. They look like flattened donuts, but firmer, like a dessert with something to prove. You bite one. It's warm, chewy, sweet, and just the tiniest bit smoky. Probably from the cart's fire pit, which doubles as both oven and hazard. In medieval cities, these portable food vendors were the lifeblood of snacking. Workers couldn't always go home for meals, so they relied on what could be grabbed in one hand and devoured in 3 bites. The options? Surprisingly rich and occasionally suspect. You head down the street where the smells intensify. Someone's frying cheese. Actual medieval fried cheese. It sizzles on a slab of iron over a flame. A peasant snatches it up with a crust of bread, bites it like a warrior, and immediately burns the roof of his mouth. Some things never change. Cheese wasn't the only snack getting the fry treatment. Lentil cakes, bean patties, and apple fritters also made the rounds. In England, records mention crispels, a kind of sweet fried dough sometimes flavored with wine and sugar. Think Chio meets medieval pancake, the kind of food that clings to your teeth and your regrets. And yes, there were sweets. Lots of them. You pass a cloaked woman at a tiny table covered in candied nuts, spiced seeds, and dried figs rolled in honey. The almonds glisten like jewels. You sample one. Crunchy, aromatic, addictive. You instantly want a dozen more. Sugar was expensive, but honey was everywhere. Beekeeping was common, and medieval recipes were obsessed with honey's versatility. Spread it, cook with it, ferment it into mead, or drizzle it over literally anything to impress your dinner guests, including, but not limited to, roast pork. Yes, sweet meat was not just tolerated, it was fashionable. Historians still argue whether the sugar meat sausage trend came from Eastern influence or just medieval experimentation gone rogue. You step into a small tavern where the cook is serving snow. Not the frozen kind, the dessert. It's a bowl of whipped cream, stiffened with sugar and flavored with rosewater or almond milk. Served chilled, if possible. Refreshing, delicate, and slightly weird when you remember there's no refrigeration. The woman next to you orders candied fennel seeds. She eats them by the handful, like medieval M&Ms. You try a few. It's like chewing licorice that's been blessed and then coated in dental floss. Not your favorite. A boy runs past selling hot pies from a cloth sack. Pork or pigeon? He shouts, and honestly, you're not sure which is more questionable. The crusts are handheld, thick, and meant to contain everything heat, gravy, bones, hope. You bite into one. It's gamey, peppery, and probably last week's meat. But the crust? Perfection. This is the medieval equivalent of a fast food hot pocket, and it's flying off the shelves. Or sacks, in this case. Back outside, you stumble across a makeshift stand where a monk in a frayed habit is hawking cough candy. You think it's medicine until you realize it's just sugar cubes infused with herbs. Good for the lungs, he says. Better with wine, he winks. You politely pretend to cough and accept a free sample. Then there are the roasted goodies, hazelnuts blackened in a wire cage, acorns soaked and boiled to remove bitterness, and even chickpeas toasted until crunchy. Street vendors walk with baskets, calling out like popcorn sellers at a theater. You grab a handful and crunch your way through something that tastes like trail mix without the fun. But perhaps the most unexpected treat is the fruit leather. Yes, medieval people made a version, boiling down fruit with honey and spreading it out to dry in sheets. You tear a strip off a rolled pear and plum blend. It's sticky, tangy, and deeply satisfying. You'd pack this for a hike. Or a joust. In wealthier households, the sweets get weirder. One cook proudly displays marchpane, a confection made from ground almonds and sugar, shaped into sculptures. Swans, castles, even knights. Think edible art meets migraine-inducing sweetness. The best part? The guests often didn't eat them, they just admired them, then handed them off to children or staff. The medieval version of Instagrammable dessert. Somewhere behind a bakery, a man in a soot-stained apron is puffing powdered sugar onto a tray of gingerbread. Except it's not soft, molassesy gingerbread like you're used to. It's rock-hard, heavily spiced, and cut into shapes. Often animals, sometimes saints, occasionally grotesque caricatures of enemies. Gingerbread was medieval satire, snack, and thread all in one. You sit on a bench, your lap full of snack scraps, and reflect on it all. Junk food may be modern in name, but its soul is ancient. Medieval folk needed pick-me-ups too. Things to crunch, nibble, slurp, or chew while wandering markets or waiting out sermons. And they were more than happy to wrap those pick-me-ups in pastry and dip them in something sweet. One final vendor offers you a drink, Hippocras. It's wine spiced with cinnamon, ginger, and sometimes cloves, served warm and sweet. It's the closest thing to medieval mulled wine. You sip. It's cozy. It's oddly complex. It's like dessert in a cup with just enough alcohol to make you forget the eel pie. As the sun sets over the rooftops and the last vendors pack up, you sigh and lean back. Your hands are sticky, your breath smells like fennel, and your pouch is slightly lighter. You didn't need any of it, but oh, was it worth it? Your fingers still glisten with a trace of honey, and your brain is somewhere between gingerbread saints and spiced wine haze. But don't drift off just yet. The medieval world of food has one more surprise in store. The medieval food hacks, tricks and workarounds people use to stretch ingredients, fake luxury, or hide a little spoilage. You know, the kind of culinary creativity born from equal parts poverty, necessity, and a dash of medieval mischief. As you meander into a dimly lit stone kitchen, the cook pulls you aside and raises a brow. Want to know how we make poor wine taste rich? He whispers. You nod. He gestures at a bubbling pot of herbs and stale raisins. Welcome to the hack. Soak your cheap wine with spice syrups, or even boil it to concentrate the flavor. Voila, instant upgrade. Kind of like putting lipstick on a barrel of vinegar. And speaking of vinegar, that was another go-to trick. Not just for preserving, but for reviving food that had started to go a little sideways. Fish smell a bit too fishy? Soak it in vinegar and herbs. Bread a little stiff? Drench it in broth. Historians still argue whether these methods were widely successful or just desperate attempts to mask decay, but hey, it's eat this or starve. One popular hack was mock food. Think tofu, but with more ambition. Need a fancy fish dish, but no fish? Mold cheese and herbs into fish shapes. 1 eggs during Lent, when animal products were forbidden. Mix almond milk, saffron, and rice flour into a yellow goo. Pour it into cleaned eggshells and gently boil it. Crack it open, and surprise, it looks like an egg. You blink. That's commitment to deception you didn't expect from people who thought bathing was risky. You move over to a wooden table where a woman is expertly carving turnips into roses. No, it's not for decoration. It's for turnip pie, which she claims tastes just like pear. You raise a skeptical brow. She slices off a piece, and, okay, you're surprised. It's not terrible. There's honey, cinnamon, and a squeeze of vinegar in the mix. It's chewy, fragrant, and just enough like fruit that your brain says, fine, we'll allow it. Another cook proudly shows off his faux meat stew. No pork? No problem. He's used breadcrumbs soaked in mushroom broth, shaped into little dumplings, and cooked with lentils and leeks. You take a spoonful. It's savory, peppery, and weirdly convincing. You catch a wink. The monks love it, he whispers. You head into a market alley, where a vendor is pounding stale bread into powder. Breadcrumbs, she explains. For thickening sauces, stretching meatballs, even fake cheese. Fake cheese? She grins and points to a lump made of breadcrumbs, vinegar, and herbs. It's white, crumbly, and about as close to feta as a rock is to tofu. But hey, food ingenuity at its finest. One of the most famous hacks? Coloring food. Natural dyes were everywhere. Spinach for green, saffron for yellow, elderberries for purple, and charcoal for black. The medieval elite loved bright food. Not because it tasted better, but because it looked expensive. You see a pie cut open to reveal vivid blue meat. It's colored with woad. Yes, the same plant used for war paint. Would you eat it? Only if you don't mind chewing on a battle flag. In a cramped town bakery, you watch a boy sprinkle crushed bone ash into flour. Don't worry, it's not his idea. His master swears it makes the bread look whiter, and therefore fancier. Not exactly FDA approved. And sadly, not uncommon. Lower-class bakers sometimes added chalk, lime, or even ground stone to bulk out flour. One quirky detail, medieval towns had bread inspectors who checked weights and ingredients. Get caught cheating? You might get pilloried, with a loaf of your fraud bread tied around your neck. Public humiliation, the original food review. Some hacks were weirdly ahead of their time. You see a cook gently smoking a trout over peat and herbs. It's preservation and flavor enhancement in one. Another has hung strips of beef in a dry, breezy room proto-jerky. Further along, a monk ferments cabbage and brine, medieval sauerkraut. Add that to the list of ancient trends the 21st century likes to pretend it invented. But not every trick was smart. You overhear a woman talking about feeding moldy bread to children by cutting off the green bits. Another swears by reboiling questionable meat with onions to make it forget it's gone off. And there's the infamous medieval belief that beer was safer than water, so infants, monks, and even nuns drank weak ale daily. Historians still argue whether this was truly safer, or just a fermented placebo with a better marketing team. You duck into a noble's kitchen where the really upscale hacks happen. The cook is crafting a meat pie with invisible herbs, spices that leave no visible trace but change the flavor dramatically. He's also using scented cloths to wrap food, infusing it with lavender, sage, or even cloves before serving. Like edible aromatherapy. You're offered a slice of chicken wrapped in rose petals. It's confusing. Tastes like poultry. Smells like your aunt's perfume. For drinks, brewers had tricks too. Ale going sour? Add herbs like ground ivy or bog myrtle to mask the taste. Meat too flat? Drop in wild fruit or flower petals and claim it's seasonal. You taste a batch flavored with dandelion and licorice root. It's ambitious. Like if springtime got confused halfway through. You peek at one final marvel, a sweet made from chickpeas and sugar formed into tiny animals. Tastes like marzipan, the boy promises. You bite. It does not. It tastes like bean paste trying very hard to be a unicorn. You nod anyway. Effort deserves respect. What all these hacks have in common is simple. Medieval people didn't let ingredients limit their imaginations. Whether they were peasants trying to make soup out of a bone and a prayer, or nobles pretending their beef was peacock, they adapted, faked it, and sometimes completely reinvented what food could be. You sit back on a hay-stuffed bench, rubbing your slightly overworked belly. Your mind is spinning with flavor memories, half-truths, and brightly dyed meat. Who knew deception could be so delicious? You lean against a barrel, still digesting the many lies your tongue has just politely swallowed. From fake pears made of turnips to meat that never met an animal, medieval food hacks have clearly had their day. But now, the lanterns flicker lower, and the air smells less of honey fritters and more like hearth smoke and damp wool. Your thoughts turn towards something simpler, something foundational, something baked. Tonight, you're going to follow the bread. Bread wasn't just a food in the Middle Ages. It was a daily ritual, a class divider, a measuring unit, even a social cue. If you were alive back then, odds are bread made up over half your caloric intake. And not in a fun baguette with brie way, but in a hope this rye lump keeps me alive until Tuesday kind of way. You step into a village bakehouse, already warm from the oven's stone belly. In the corner, a young apprentice is heaving sacks of barley flour while a flour-dusted woman slaps wet dough onto wooden boards. It smells tangy and earthy, like something living is just barely being tamed. Which it is, really. Bread dough in the Middle Ages was often leavened with wild yeast from sourdough starters. Store-bought yeast? Try catching wild yeast on your windowsill with a bucket of patience and a prayer. For the poor, the bread was coarse, dark, and speckled with bits of bran, chaff, and sometimes sand or grit. Not on purpose, just the unfortunate result of primitive grinding tools. Chew carefully, or your dentist, if you had one, and you didn't, would be appalled. Archaeologists actually study medieval skeletons and can spot tooth damage from this gritty flour. Think of it as the original crunchy bread, but with added dental hazards. You're handed a piece of black rye bread. It's dense, heavy, almost sour. Chewing it takes effort. And time. Honestly, it's the kind of food that slows down your entire afternoon. But that was the point. It filled you up cheaply and didn't spoil too quickly. With a dab of lard or a dip in ale, it became not just edible, but comforting. Up a hill, past the thatched roofs and grazing pigs, you enter a manor kitchen. The bread here is different. Softer, whiter, finer. The flour has been sifted through cloth to remove the bran. This is manchet bread, fit for nobles. Delicate, expensive, and served in slices at feasts, not always to be eaten, mind you, but sometimes just used as fancy edible plates. These trenchers absorbed sauces and meat drippings. When dinner was over, they were given to servants or beggars. Recycled flavor, medieval style. Historians still argue whether these trencher breads were truly edible after soaking up a full course of gravy and grease, or if they were glorified compost. Either way, you can't help but marvel at the idea of your plate being part of the menu. You glance around and notice another class of bread, horse bread. Nope, not named for the animal who made it, but the one who was supposed to eat it. Oats, beans, bran, and anything vaguely edible went into these rough loaves, which were usually fed to horses or sometimes, in desperate times, to people. You're offered a bite. It tastes like resentment. Then there were specialty breads, spice breads made for holidays, communion wafers stamped with sacred symbols, and pretzels twisted by monks who apparently believed carbohydrates could be holy geometry. You wander into a convent bakery where the sisters are shaping dough into tiny coils, symbolic knots, meant to represent prayer. They're dusted with salt and baked hard. They hand you one. It crunches like a sanctified cracker. Over in the town square, the Bakers' Guild has set up shop. Yes, guilds. Baking was so essential to medieval life that entire associations formed to regulate it. Bakers couldn't just bake whatever, whenever. They were inspected, fined, even jailed for cheating the weight of a loaf. In England, they had to abide by the assize of bread, a medieval bread law that fixed loaf prices according to grain costs. Break the rule? You might get tossed in the pillory, or worse, your bakery could be shut down. One quirky little offshoot of this law, the baker's dozen. Since underweight bread could get you in serious trouble, bakers would throw in an extra roll or two just to be safe. 13 became the new 12, and history got itself a fun idiom. You round the back of a kitchen where loaves cool on racks, and a baker carves a small cross into each round before baking. To let the devil out, he says with a wink. Or, possibly, to allow steam to escape evenly. Historians still argue which was the real reason, but both explanations seem oddly appropriate. In some regions, bread played ceremonial roles. At weddings, loaves were broken over the bride's head for fertility luck. At funerals, mourners might eat soul cakes to honor the dead. One particularly odd ritual? Bread baked in the shape of limbs as a healing charm. Have a sore leg? Eat a leg-shaped loaf and hope for the best. You're handed a thick slice of pain d'epics, a dense honey spice bread from France. It's dark, rich, and surprisingly flavorful. It borders on cake, probably because it's mostly honey. You chew slowly, letting the ginger and anise mingle. It's a rare treat, one you'd only get on feast days if you were lucky. Even in prison, bread made an appearance. It was often the only food served to inmates, sometimes intentionally stale or moldy. And in some religious orders, monks would fast on bread and water alone, partly for piety, partly for penance. You can't help but wonder how spiritual you'd feel with a belly full of barley bricks. You finish your rounds at a traveling market stand selling hot bread fresh from the fire. The loaf is wrapped in cloth and handed to you with reverence. It's smoky, chewy, and warm in your hands like a heat stone. You hold it close, letting the steam rise into the cold night air. In that moment, it doesn't matter what century you're in, bread is comfort. And maybe that's what keeps it alive, century after century. Whether it's a coarse rice slab in a peasant's pouch or a soft manchet on a noble's platter, bread is the edible rhythm of the Middle Ages. So much so, in fact, that the word companion literally means someone you share bread with. You break off another piece and smile. Not bad for something made of flour, water, and hope. You brush the last crumbs of manchet bread from your tunic and step away from the warmth of the village oven. But don't get too cozy just yet. We're about to wander into a stranger culinary chapter. Food is medicine. Because in the Middle Ages, people didn't just eat to live or to celebrate, they ate to heal. Or at least, they tried to. Picture this. You're in a timber-framed apothecary, shelves lined with little ceramic jars and bundles of dried herbs dangling from the ceiling. The air smells like thyme, vinegar, and something vaguely peppery, probably a clove that's seen better centuries. A sleepy-eyed herbalist nods at you and says, "A spoon of honey for that cough. A leek poultice if your foot's gone wrong." Then she picks up a goose feather and starts writing a recipe for melancholy stew. You may want to sit down. Food and health were deeply intertwined in medieval thought, but not in the quinoa smoothie kind of way. Nope, back then, it all came down to the humors, those mysterious bodily fluids, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. The balance of these humors supposedly determined everything about your health, personality, and even diet. Too much black bile? You were melancholic and needed warming foods. Too much phlegm? Eat hot and dry things. Like roasted onions. Lots of roasted onions. The concept of hot and cold foods had nothing to do with temperature. Melons were cold and moist. Garlic was hot and dry. Historians still argue whether this framework helped anyone feel better or just gave people an excuse to categorize everything, but it was the dominant medical lens for centuries. You're handed a bowl of pottage laced with fennel, sage, and a strange bitter root. The cook smiles. Good for your liver and keeps the bad spirits out. Right. You take a cautious sip. It tastes like grass and regret. Some foods were considered superfoods long before the term existed. Garlic, for instance, was praised for its healing powers. It was used to treat infections, clear sinuses, and keep demons away, though modern scholars debate which effect was more reliable. Honey, with its antimicrobial properties, was spread on wounds as well as bread. You dip your finger into a little pot of it, thick and golden. Sweet, soothing, and a rare treat, unless you were lucky enough to keep bees. And then there's leeks. Oh, the humble leek. Monks loved them, saints swore by them, and apothecaries brewed them into everything from tonics to teas. One quirky remedy? Leek juice boiled with wine and smeared into the ears for earaches. You wince just imagining the smell. But hey, worth it for medieval eardrum bliss? You wander into a monastery infirmary. It's quiet, calm, and filled with the scent of rosemary and candle wax. A monk is making a medicinal broth of parsnip, barley, and chopped figs. For digestion, he murmurs. You ask what's in the jar he's shaking over the pot. He says it's ground pearls. You blink. Pearls? Calms the heart, he says. Well, if your heart's ever going to be calm, it's after sipping $400 soup dusted with jewelry. Oddly enough, beer and wine weren't just recreational, they were prescribed. Weak ale, sometimes infused with herbs like horehound or wormwood, was a daily tonic. Safer than water, they'd claim, though historians still argue whether that's actually true or just a cheerful justification for day drinking. You pass a boy chewing on raw parsley. He says it's for bad breath. Nearby, a woman is sipping hot milk stirred with nutmeg to soothe her nerves. A wandering doctor is selling digestive cookies made of anise and coriander. You try one. It's oddly delightful. Crunchy, sweet, and almost refreshing. Turns out, these little treats weren't just snacks. They were part of a post-meal ritual meant to calm the stomach and ward off bloating. Like medieval Tums, but tastier. You stumble upon a recipe book written in Latin and smeared with what you hope is wine. One recipe claims a stew made of swan, almond milk, and ground dates can lift a melancholic spirit. Another insists boiled lettuce leaves eaten before bed ensure restful sleep. You try to imagine lying in a straw bed, full of soggy greens, waiting for dreams. Cozy. And yes, some of the medical meals were just flat-out bizarre. Like snail broth for fevers, or mashed dried toads wrapped in bread as a treatment for plague. Did they work? You don't ask. You just nod politely and keep your distance from the amphibian corner of the kitchen. You overhear a noblewoman steward describing her strict diet: white bread only, chicken soaked in milk, boiled apples, and wine. All cooling and moist foods to balance her fiery nature. You quietly wonder if she's just picky. But in truth, the upper classes followed these rules religiously. Meals were planned not for taste, but for medical harmony. Even desserts had cooling herbs like mint or rosewater. In rural villages, though, the approach was simpler and a bit more superstitious. You see an old woman pressing garlic cloves into a child's shoes to ward off infection. A man drinks nettle tea for his joints. Someone insists that eating 9 gooseberries before dawn on Midsummer's Day will cure any illness for a year. You start counting berries on a bush, just in case. One local legend says if you eat a roasted apple stuffed with cloves while whispering a prayer to Saint Apollonia, it'll heal your toothache. You're tempted. Your teeth still remember that gritty bread from earlier. As you make your way back to the village square, the sun's fading and lanterns begin to glow amber in the breeze. A woman hands you a warm cup of spiced wine. For the cold, she says, though you suspect it's also for the soul. You sip. It's mulled with cinnamon and a hint of something floral. Maybe lavender. Maybe medieval mystery. It becomes clear that the line between food and medicine was never firm in the Middle Ages. What you ate could be healing, harmful, holy, or all three, depending on the day. Science wasn't yet science. Taste wasn't always king. But the effort, the hope, the ritual of eating to feel better, it's deeply human. And as the warm wine slides down your throat, you start to understand. Whether it's ginger in tea or a prayer over porridge, everyone's looking for a little relief from the weight of the world. The night deepens, and the spiced wine has left your cheeks a little flushed. You wander farther from the central square, where the noise of gossip and clinking spoons fades into softer rhythms, like the sound of a knife scraping a chopping board or the slow sizzle of fat in a pan. You're not just listening to food tonight. You're watching it become. Because now, it's time to peer behind the curtains of the medieval kitchen and meet the real artists behind the era's cuisine, the cooks. Not celebrity chefs, not culinary influencers, just everyday cooks, sweating over open flames, twisting dough, and muttering under their breath about which lord wants his quail deboned. You step through the smoky wooden door of a noble household kitchen and are instantly hit by the chaos. One person is stirring a pot with a spoon bigger than your head. Another is scaling fish with quick, practiced flicks. Someone else is plucking feathers from a goose that still looks insulted to be here. Medieval kitchens were hot, loud, and full of danger. No fancy stoves, just open hearths or raised braziers, with pots hanging over roaring flames. You think of your own kitchen at home, maybe a bit messy, maybe overdue for a scrub, but at least it doesn't include a fire pit next to an ox tongue stewing in wine. The cook here, let's call her Ellen, is yelling at an apprentice for forgetting to soak the lentils. She's been cooking since dawn and still has hours to go. Her hands are strong, her apron singed, and her temper short. But her food? It's the stuff nobles write poems about. She knows how to roast a rabbit until it falls apart like butter, how to make almond milk when there's no cow in sight, and how to layer a meat pie so the flavors stack like a lullaby. Now, lest you think medieval cooks had total freedom, let's talk about menus. In noble homes, meals were pre-planned by stewards, sometimes weeks in advance. Cooks had to follow strict expectations. The goose must be larded with bacon. The venison must be served with a ginger and wine sauce. Heaven forbid the wrong dish is served on a fast day. You didn't just whip something up, you obeyed the feast plan. Meanwhile, over in a monastery kitchen, Brother Thomas is quietly chopping leeks. No shouting, no feasts, just quiet dedication. The meals here are meatless, in line with religious restrictions. But they're hearty: barley stews, chickpea mash, thick onion soups, and oat porridge. Thomas slices bread with the reverence of a sacred rite. His cooking isn't for praise, it's for contemplation. And maybe fiber. You pass through the kitchen of a merchant's townhouse next. The cook here is lean, sharp-eyed, and proudly experimental. He's got dried orange peels imported from Iberia and is debating whether to add rosewater to the eel jelly. Historians still argue whether this kind of fusion cuisine was common or just the pastime of well-funded kitchen eccentrics. You catch a glimpse of a handwritten recipe. To make a tart of strawberries, take strawberries and grind them with wine and crumbled bread. Simple. Surprisingly modern. Some recipes from the 14th century read like instructions from your trendy food blog, minus the paragraph about someone's grandmother's favorite measuring spoon. But not everything was so romantic. Down in the servant kitchens, the atmosphere changes. No imported cinnamon here, just stale rye bread, boiled cabbage, and maybe a slice of cured bacon if it's a feast day. The cook, likely a young woman with blisters on her palms, stirs relentlessly to keep the pottage from burning. There's no artistry here, only necessity. And then there's street food. Yes, even in the 1300s, if you didn't want to cook, you could find something hot and ready. Vendors with charcoal braziers sold meat pies, pancakes, or fried fish. You bite into a chewette, a little meat-filled pastry, and burn your tongue. Of course, street food never changes. Cooks were also part-time illusionists. For royal feasts, they created subtleties, elaborate edible sculptures. A swan redressed in its own feathers. A castle made of sugar. A pie that, when cut open, releases live birds. You stare as a kitchen boy carries one of these pies, shaking slightly, praying the birds don't escape prematurely. Yes, this is where the 4 and 20 blackbirds baked in a pie rhyme got its start. Weird, but true. One strange little gem? Cooks would sometimes make imitation food. Fake fish made from molded cheese. Meat pies filled with spiced nuts instead of meat. It's not entirely clear whether this was for amusement or dietary trickery during fasting days. Historians still argue whether it was clever culinary disguise or just a medieval prank. Cooking wasn't just hard work, it was also dangerous. Open flames, heavy pots, boiling oil, sharp knives, no fire code. A wrong move could mean burns, broken bones, or worse. It wasn't uncommon for entire kitchens to go up in smoke. That's why wealthier homes often built them as separate buildings. Better to lose the pudding than the palace. And here's a quirky detail. In some cities, cooks had their own guilds, complete with regulations. You couldn't just call yourself a cook, you had to earn that title. There were apprenticeships, tests, and rules about using spoiled ingredients. Though whether anyone followed those rules is, predictably, still debated. As you step out into the back alley, you see a young boy stirring a pot over a small fire. It's his family's dinner, barley and onions with a single scrap of salt pork. No recipe book. No master chef. Just instinct, memory, and hunger. Maybe that's the purest cooking of all. You walk away from the kitchen buzz, the air now thick with lingering smells, herbs, broth, charred wood, and a bit of sweat. There's something sacred in it. Not in a religious way, but in a human way. Food being shaped by hands, again and again, to sustain, to soothe, to impress, to survive. Cooks don't often make it into the official chronicles. But tonight, in the flicker of torchlight and the clatter of ladles, you know they held history in their wooden spoons. Your journey carries you away from the clattering kitchens and into the storerooms and cellars, because if there's one thing the medieval world truly excelled at, it was preserving food. After all, without refrigeration, you couldn't just stash your leftovers in a plastic container and call it a day. Nope. In the Middle Ages, survival over the winter meant knowing how to out-wheat time itself. You step into a cool, dimly lit cellar. The walls sweat with moisture, and the air smells faintly of apples, dust, and something vinegary. Shelves groan under the weight of preserved treasures, salted fish, dried beans, wheels of cheese, little clay pots sealed with wax. You're not sure whether this room is preparing for a feast or the apocalypse. The logic was simple: grow, hunt, or buy food when you could, and preserve it so it lasted. Pickling, drying, salting, fermenting, smoking, and storing in fat were all part of the daily survival kit. Not exactly glamorous, but without it, you'd be gnawing bark come February. Take salting, for instance. One of the oldest and most common techniques. Herring, pork, and beef were rubbed with salt until they looked like fossilized bricks, then stored in barrels to sit and soak in their own salty dreams. You have a chunk of salted cod. It's heavy, dry, and smells like a sea shanty in solid form. Rehydration took hours, sometimes days, and even then, it was often chewier than a medieval boot. Then there's smoking. You glance up at a blackened wooden beam where sausages still hang, turning slowly in the smoky warmth of a low fire. Not only did it dry out meat and fish, but the smoke also added flavor and, importantly, kept pests away. Because yes, bugs were a constant battle. Remember the weevils in your bread? Yeah, those weren't limited to grain. In fact, medieval storage was an ongoing war against insects, mold, mice, and the occasional opportunistic cat. People lined shelves with bay leaves to keep bugs at bay, sprinkled ashes around barrels, and even sealed jars with pig's bladder or wax. One housewife's guide recommends setting a knife upright in the oats to keep the devil out. It's unclear whether the devil refers to rats or something more theological. Historians still argue whether this was superstition or low-level pest control. Drying was another lifesaver. Herbs, fruit, grains all hung in bundles or laid out on cloths under the sun. Apples were sliced thin and dried into leathery rings. You nibble one, and it tastes like cider and dust. Not bad, actually. Peas and beans were dried until they rattled like maracas, then rehydrated into hearty pottages when needed. And let's not forget cheese. Glorious, moldy, miraculous cheese. Without refrigeration, milk had to be used quickly or transformed. Soft cheeses like fresh curds were eaten fast, but harder cheeses were pressed, aged, and stored for months. Some were coated in wax or ash. Others were simply trusted to do their thing, developing rinds tougher than your travel boots. You pass a wheel of cheese that looks more like a medieval weapon than a snack. A label says it's 3 years old. You make a mental note to respect its wisdom. Fermentation wasn't just for beer. Cabbage became sauerkraut. Milk became kefir. Fruit and honey turned into mead. Vinegar was made from spoiled wine, because waste not, want not. Even bread dough was often left to ferment slightly, especially sourdoughs, which used wild yeasts. And sometimes, the line between preserved and gone wrong got a little blurry. You sniff a jar of something pickled in brine with floating herbs and, is that a tiny crab? You slowly put the lid back on. Fats, too, played their part. Meat could be cooked and sealed in its own fat, like an early confit, then stored in earthen pots. Think of it as medieval Tupperware, just less clicky and more gloopy. Duck legs packed in lard could keep for weeks in the right cellar. Now, some preservation was less scientific and more magical. You find bundles of garlic braided and hung like wards against both spoilage and spirits. A barrel of apples has charms etched into the wood, small crosses, runes, even a prayer scratched into the lid. People believed food was alive in a spiritual way, and that certain foods needed watching, guarding, or even pleading with to keep well. You overhear a woman whispering to her jars of pickled onions, telling them to behave through the winter. You pretend not to notice. One truly quirky tidbit: preserving eggs. Without modern refrigeration, eggs were stored in lime water or ash, even buried in grain bins. Some were coated in beeswax. One recipe suggests packing the eggs in salt and turning weekly. You wonder if these eggs developed anxiety. Still, better than cracking one open in March to find a medieval surprise. But preservation wasn't just about preventing spoilage. It was about ensuring you could celebrate when the time came. Feasts were built on what you'd managed to save. That dried fruit? It went into pies at Christmas. Those salted fish? Served during Lent. Those jars of jam and ale? Brought out for weddings, wakes, and saint days. Winter might be lean, but not always bleak. Some foods were intentionally fermented into delicacies. You stumble upon a crock of fish sauce, an Anglo-Norman attempt at garum. Pungent, sour, and possibly weaponizable. It was used to season food long before soy sauce arrived on the scene. Historians still argue whether it added flavor or just fear. And oh, the cellars. These were the heart of preservation. Dug deep into the earth, cool and damp, lined with barrels, jars, sacks, and silence. You run your fingers along a dusty row of earthenware pots and feel centuries of planning, patience, and quiet desperation. Above ground, a woman finishes hanging the last of her plum slices on a rack outside. She wipes her hands on her apron, nods toward the cloudy sky, and mutters about an early frost. For her, this isn't nostalgia, it's necessity. Even in castles, the story's the same. The lord may dine on roast peacock, but somewhere below, the cook is checking if the salted pork has gone green. Preserved food wasn't glamorous, but it was gold. You walk away from the cellar slowly, the smells of brine, cheese, and smoked meat still clinging to your cloak. The warmth of preservation lies not just in the salt or vinegar, but in the care, the waiting, the hope. Because to preserve food, in any age, is to believe in tomorrow. You step out of the cool cellar and into the sharp morning air of a marketplace already bustling with motion. It's not a weekend pop-up with avocado toast. This is a proper medieval market. Cobblestones slick with mud, vendors shouting in 3 different dialects, and somewhere, the unmistakable smell of goat. Here, money, or its many awkward medieval equivalents, changes hands, and food becomes commerce. This is where food lives outside the home. The in-between space, the hustle. The trade route's final stop before something lands in someone's stew pot. And today, you're browsing with coins jangling in your pouch, though you're not entirely sure what any of them are worth. That worn silver penny might get you a slab of cheese, or just a firm nod, depending on where you are and how confident you look. Markets were the lifeblood of medieval towns and villages. Weekly or bi-weekly, they drew crowds from miles away. You squeeze between 2 stalls, avoiding a haphazardly placed fish cart and nearly trip on a turnip. On your left, salted herring in rough wooden barrels, its scent sharp enough to double as a weapon. On your right, baskets of onions, leeks, and cabbages that look like they've seen some things. Behind every pile is a story. Those dried figs? Probably came from a ship docked in Marseille. The saffron threads tied in a tight twist of cloth? Smuggled, maybe. Or carried by a spice merchant who rode halfway across Persia and just wants a nap. You're holding global history in your palm, and possibly some flea eggs. Some vendors shout out prices. Others just stare you down, silently daring you to haggle. And you should, because in the Middle Ages, bargaining wasn't rude, it was expected. You ask how much for a round of soft cheese. The seller squints at you, then says, "For you? 2 pence. For my cousin? 1. You decide to be flattered and move on. There's an open debate about the buying power of medieval wages. Historians still argue whether a day's pay could feed a family or barely stretch to a loaf of coarse bread. What's clear is that shopping wasn't easy. Prices fluctuated wildly depending on harvests, weather, wars, and royal taxes. That same cheese might double in cost during a hard winter, or disappear altogether. One stand catches your eye. A woman is selling pies. Small, handheld, greasy at the edges. You take one bite and realize it's turnip and beef fat, barely seasoned but oddly comforting. Medieval fast food, you think. Portable, cheap, and perfect for a day spent hauling wool or surviving feudalism. She grins as she hands you a second one on the house. You wonder how many generations her family's been making these. Not everyone came to buy. Some came to sell what little they had. Goat milk in earthen jars, bundles of wild herbs, a few eggs. You pass a teenage boy nervously clutching a string of dead pigeons. He's not quite sure they'll sell, but it beats another week on just barley mash. And just beyond the main stalls, near the churchyard wall, are the tinkers and traveling vendors. A man is frying onions on a portable brazier, shouting something about gravy hotcakes. It smells incredible, even if the meat is ambiguous. Another woman offers candied nuts wrapped in waxed cloth. You take one, your teeth sticking together like she's cast a spell. There's an entire ecosystem here. Bakers with crusty rye loaves, brewers selling small beer by the mug, brewers' wives pouring out thin, sour ale. A miller with sacks of coarse flour argues loudly with a fishwife over stall space. And everywhere, kids dart between legs, hoping to snag a fallen apple or sneak a taste of treacle. You notice that market regulations are posted on a faded parchment nailed to a post. Weights must be fair, no watering down the milk, no selling stale flesh. Of course, enforcing those rules was a different matter. Some meat sellers used clever tricks, like wiping cuts with vinegar to mask spoilage or stuffing sausages with sawdust and spices. One fringe tidbit? Some sellers would even re-dye spoiled meat with crushed herbs to make it look fresher. Historians still argue whether that was common practice or just the medieval version of an urban legend. Not all markets were the same. In the countryside, they were more rustic, sheep tied to posts, hens pecking around, and the occasional bartering session where a dozen eggs got you a tin pot. In the cities, you might find more exotic goods, lemons, ginger, almonds from distant lands, and shopkeepers who were less forgiving if you tried to pay with the wrong coin. And then there were fairs. Massive, chaotic, and rare. They drew merchants from across Europe and turned whole towns into food festivals. Roasted meats, sugared dates, mead stalls, jugglers with pastries balanced on their heads. You imagine walking through one on a summer evening, a spiced wine in hand, laughter in the air, and the warm knowledge that for a few days at least, food was everywhere, and joy didn't have to be rationed. Of course, market food wasn't always clean. Without modern hygiene, food safety was more of a gamble than a guarantee. Milk spoiled quickly. Fruit rotted fast. Bread molded if it was left out. You see a woman sniffing a fish suspiciously. A nearby cat also looks concerned. That's never a good sign. But still, for many people, the market was the heart of life. It was where food met fellowship, where someone might spend their last coin on a tiny cake for their child or trade a woven basket for a handful of onions, where you could buy a pie, hear the latest gossip, and lose your chicken all in the same hour. As you walk past the last stall, the din of haggling and laughter fades behind you. You carry a small cloth bag. Inside, half a loaf of rye, a pinch of salt, a pie, and a single, wrinkled apple. Nothing fancy, but enough to remind you that in the medieval world, food was never just food. It was survival, community, pride, and maybe, if the pie was warm and the seller smiled, a tiny taste of happiness. You're walking now, full from that greasy meat pie, and a little sleepy from the clamor of the market. But your journey's far from over, because we haven't talked about the people who made the food. Not the lords and ladies, not the stall holders hawking fried eel, but the unsung, flour-dusted heroes of medieval kitchens, the cooks. Not just any cooks, mind you, professional cooks. The ones hired by nobles, monasteries, or wealthy townsfolk to wrangle ingredients, manage fires, and somehow create feasts using tools that look more like blacksmith gear than cooking equipment. You find yourself inside a great manners kitchen. It's hot, noisy, and absolutely chaotic. The kind of chaos where someone's yelling about missing gooseberries, a boy's dropping a jug of ale, and a woman is furiously grinding spices like she's trying to summon a demon. And yet, there's order beneath the mess. Every move is practiced. Every station is working. At the center, the master cook, part general, part magician, part therapist, shouting orders like a ship captain in a storm. Being a cook wasn't some gentle, apron-wearing affair. It was brutal. Long hours, dangerous tools, open flames. And let's not forget, you were cooking for people with power, egos, and very particular tastes. If the roast boar was underdone, that could cost you more than just your job. You might get publicly shamed, fined, or sent to the stocks with yesterday's stew dumped on your head. Yet these cooks were innovators. Take the form of curry, a 14th century English cookbook. It includes recipes like eggs and mustard sauce and hedgehog made of pork, not real hedgehogs. Relax. These instructions weren't just for flavor, they were performance. Imagine serving a pie that, when cut, releases live birds, or a roast swan redressed in its own feathers. Historians still argue whether these displays were ever eaten or just meant to impress. Edible sculpture meets competitive showboating. And while rich households had these culinary masterminds, monasteries had their own skilled food teams. You pass through a monastic kitchen where silence is golden, but the food is far from plain. Monks and lay brothers are chopping onions, baking loaves, and preparing lentil pottage with the focus of artists. Even in periods of fasting, the dishes had depth: almond milk broths, spiced vegetables, dried fruit stews. One quirky tidbit? In certain monasteries, the cook was allowed to taste meat during Lent, but only to check for spoilage, and only if he spat it out. Historians still argue whether this was strictly followed, or if some spoiled meat was just conveniently delicious. Back in the manor kitchen, you notice a distinct hierarchy. At the top, the master cook. Beneath him, assistants for sauces, meats, baking. Then the scullions, the lowest of the low, cleaning pans, fetching water, and occasionally being blamed for everything. If the goose burned, probably a scullion's fault. If the Lord's porridge was lumpy, guess who's scrubbing pots until midnight? Yet, despite the pressure, these cooks developed remarkable systems. Recipes weren't written down so much as remembered and passed orally. Measurements were imprecise, a good handful, a while over the fire, a nut of butter. And still, the meals came out right. Mostly. You pick up a medieval ladle, it's enormous. Like, could double as a rowing or enormous. Cooks weren't making dinner for two. They were feeding households of 50 or more. That meant meat roasted on giant spits turned by hand, or by dog-powered treadmills, cauldrons simmering over smoky hearths, and bread ovens the size of small cottages. And the ingredients? Always in flux. One day, you might have spices from Genoa. The next, just salt and turnips. A great cook had to improvise constantly, turning shortages into creativity. No rabbit? Try spiced lentils shaped like meatballs. No fresh herbs? Use dried ones and pretend it's intentional. One cook, a legend among the castle staff, once served the same meal stew 3 days in a row, but with different garnishes and clever names each time. Nobody noticed. Or maybe they were just too polite. Food preparation wasn't just about cooking, it was about presentation. Remember, nobility expected meals to impress. There was a strong performative element. Food dyed with saffron or parsley to make it golden or green. Sauces thickened with breadcrumbs and almond paste. Jellies molded into towers or fish shapes. You lift a carved wooden mold shaped like a castle, designed to make jelly that wobbled in the shape of victory. Cooks also had to understand dietary rules. Fridays were meatless. Lent lasted 40 days. Advent meant fasting. And every saint seemed to bring their own rules. So they adapted, using fish, eggs, cheese, almond milk, and dried fruit. It's no exaggeration to say they were early masters of plant-based cuisine, centuries before it trended on Instagram. Let's not ignore the darker side, though. In some big kitchens, apprentices were beaten for mistakes. Scullions were mocked. Hygiene wasn't exactly emphasized. A drop spoon? Maybe rinse it. Maybe not. You spot a large rat scurrying under a bench. The cook throws a ladle at it. The rat wins. Still, you can't help but admire the sheer resilience of these cooks. Underpaid, overworked, and always a single bread disaster away from ruin. And yet, they kept the castle fed, the lord happy, and the kitchen alive. A warm loaf is handed to you fresh from the oven, thick, crusty, and smelling of smoke and rye. You tear off a piece and let it melt in your mouth. It tastes of fire and flour, of effort and history. You lean back against the warm stone wall, watching the cooks bustle about, knowing that in this kitchen, the heart of the home beats loudest. Because in the medieval world, if you wanted to eat, truly eat, you needed someone brave enough to face fire, chaos, and noble egos, and still make a pie that didn't burn. You're walking again, but this time, not through a manor kitchen or market stall. No, now you're heading toward the fringe, the edge of town, or maybe the edge of society. Because not all food in the Middle Ages came from bustling marketplaces or lavish kitchens. Some of it was, well, let's call it opportunistic. You know those odd, unlabeled snack boxes you see at office break rooms? Now imagine that, but in the wild. That's scavenger cuisine. Tonight, you're going to explore what people ate when they were desperate, clever, or simply had zero options left. You pass a beggar crouched near a ditch, boiling something in a dented tin pot. You squint, and yes, those are weeds. Dandelion greens, to be precise. Tough, bitter, but technically food. People in the Middle Ages knew their edible plants like we know our food delivery apps. If it grew, they had at least tried to eat it. Sorrel, nettles, chickweed. Basically, the original superfoods, though no one was posting about them on medieval TikTok. Some of these plants were surprisingly nutritious. Nettles, for instance, packed iron, and once boiled, they lost their sting. But it wasn't always about health, it was about survival. You chew a leaf and it tastes like lawn trimmings soaked in regret. Fringe food wasn't just plants, though. Oh no, this was a world where protein sources could get creative. Hedgehogs, badgers, dormice, and frogs made it onto some menus. Not everywhere, of course, but in rural villages or times of famine. If it moved and wasn't obviously poisonous, it was a maybe. Historians still argue whether urban poor regularly turned to rats or insects in hard times. The documentation is murky, and records tend to skip over the diets of the very poor. But we do know that famine years drove people to horrifying extremes. There are records of bread made from ground bark, moss, and even clay. That's not a recipe. It's a cry for help. And yet, people were resourceful. Take the concept of pottage. We've talked about it before. It's the catch-all stew. But for the truly broke, pottage might just be water, some onion peel, and a few leaves of cabbage, cooked until it vaguely resembled food. A fringe tidbit? Some folks added crushed snail shells as a calcium supplement. Whether that worked or just crunched weird is still up for debate. You come across a group of children gathering snails after a rainstorm. They drop them into a basket and wave. Snails were considered decent eating in many places, once you purged them properly. Which, yes, meant feeding them clean food for days before cooking. Gourmet? Sort of. Grimy? Definitely. In the woods beyond town, you spot a man setting traps not for deer, but for birds and squirrels. He carries a sling and a quiet patience. Poaching was illegal, of course, but common. Many peasants weren't allowed to hunt game in noble forests, yet they did it anyway. Stealing a rabbit could earn you a fine. Stealing a deer? That could get you hanged. And yet, people risked it, again and again. Hunger does that. And then there were the riverbanks and seashores, nature's supermarket for those who could wait. You dip your hand into a rock pool and find mussels clinging to the side. A local woman nearby warns you, boil them twice. Or once, if you trust your luck. You don't. But you take the mussel anyway. Urban scavenging was its own beast. In cities, the poor sifted through refuse, looking for anything remotely edible. Baker's scraps, vegetable peelings, yesterday's half-eaten bread. There's a grim dignity in salvaging a bruised apple, brushing off the grime, and pretending it was always yours. Sometimes, scraps became full-on meals. One documented practice involved collecting marrow bones discarded by wealthy kitchens, cracking them open, and boiling the shreds of fat and collagen into a thin broth. It was barely food, but it was warm, and warmth, in a medieval winter, counted for a lot. You wander into a tiny alley where a woman is baking something on a flat rock beside a small flame. She offers you a corner. It's chewy, a little sour, and deeply smoky. It's made from acorn flour. Ground acorns were a fallback grain substitute, bitter unless leached properly, but better than starvation. And then there's one of the strangest fringe snacks of the age, fermented fish sauce. Yes, like Roman garum, but darker, funkier, and often made from local river fish left to break down in the sun. Imagine soy sauce and compost had a baby. People added it to pottage, bread, even porridge for extra flavor or to cover up the taste of rot. Historians still argue whether versions of this persisted across medieval Europe, or if it was mostly rumor fermented alongside the fish. You hear a story from a weathered old man, how once, during a harsh snow, his grandmother roasted her old leather shoe, softened it in milk, scraped the inside, and called it cow tongue. You laugh, but he doesn't. And maybe he's not joking. It's a reminder that in medieval life, hunger wasn't some dramatic twist, it was a recurring guest. Everyone danced with it at some point, rich and poor alike. The fringes of food were where creativity met desperation, where people turned the inedible into dinner through sheer willpower and a hot enough fire. You sip a thin broth made from leek ends and sour milk. It's oddly soothing. A reminder that flavor isn't always the goal, sustenance is. And even at the edges of society, people found ways to survive, to stretch one turnip, one loaf, one bitter leaf into another day. Because in the end, the medieval diet wasn't just about what was available, it was about what you could make of it. And sometimes, survival tasted like weeds, wood ash, and determination. The streets are quiet now. The market's emptied, the taverns have dimmed, and even the bakers are banking their fires for the night. You're full, emotionally, historically, and maybe a little physically from the odd snacks you've picked up along the way. But there's one more stop before we wind down completely. Tonight, you're slipping into the dining hall of a late medieval inn. Not one of those dodgy roadside shacks where you sleep with your boots on and pray the stew doesn't fight back. This is a halfway decent establishment, lit by flickering tallow candles, packed with travelers sharing benches, and noisy with the kind of laughter that says, "I made it through another day." And what's on the menu? Well, that depends who you are. Inns in the Middle Ages often had tiered meals. A wealthier merchant might get roast chicken with sauce and white bread. A poorer peddler might be stuck with barley gruel, some dried peas, and ale so weak it's basically flavored water. But they all eat together, sort of. You sit down beside a wool merchant chewing through a slab of salted beef, so tough, he's visibly regretting it. He offers you a bite. You decline, politely. That thing could qualify as construction material. The innkeeper bustles past, carrying a tray of trenchers, those rough slabs of stale bread used as plates, soaked in sauce and then thrown out. Or, more often, handed off to the poor waiting outside. Or to the pigs. Or to the poor and the pigs. Historians still argue who got the better end of that deal. The inn is full of smells: overboiled cabbage, frying onions, the unmistakable waft of someone using way too much garlic to hide something slightly off. You sip from a wooden cup of ale, not strong, but safe. Safer than the water, anyway. And here, at this table, you're seeing the true last layer of medieval food culture: community. After all the herbs, the hedgehogs, the pies and porridge, what it really came down to was sharing. Food was a social glue. Even if you were chewing dried fish with splinters in it, you were doing it with someone beside you. You watch two traveling clerks argue over how long you have to boil eels to make them edible. One insists 7 minutes. The other swears it's 30. A third man chimes in that raw eel is just strong sushi. Everyone laughs, and you can't help it. You do too. One fringe tidbit that surfaces? Inns were sometimes accused of adding odd ingredients to stretch meals: breadcrumbs as meat filler, sawdust and bread, even moss disguised as herbs. Whether that was common practice or a smear campaign from jealous competitors is still debated. But your stew does taste earthy. Still, it's warm. And in the drafty, unpredictable world of medieval life, warmth is everything. You watch as the fire crackles low, casting soft amber light on weary faces. Someone strums a lute in the corner, badly, and a dog snores under the table. A man offers you a piece of cheese from his pouch. It's hard, sharp, and a little crumbly. A bite of the real Middle Ages. This, right here, feels like the ending. Not a dramatic banquet or a famine hallucination, just a shared meal, a warm space, a moment of stillness. Because in between all the bizarre food, questionable hygiene, and eel-based debates, medieval people were, well, just people. Hungry, tired, often poor, but resilient. And always ready to make do. And as you lean back, full of turnip tails and hedgehog roasts, you realize something. You probably wouldn't have survived this. Not because of the dangers, not even because of the food, but because, let's be honest, you complain when your oat milk's the wrong brand. Still, you made it through this story. And maybe, just maybe, you've earned your spot at the table. Right here. With the crusty bread, the too salty stew, and the people who made it all happen. Because medieval junk food? It wasn't always delicious. But it was never boring. So now, as the embers glow low, and the echoes of laughter fade, the inn quiets to a hush. The last scraps of bread have been claimed, the stew pot scraped clean, and the fire gently crackles into coals. Even the dog under the table shifts in his sleep, belly full and snoring softly. You settle back into your bench, your limbs heavy, your mind thick with images of spiced pies, clumsy ale spills, and trenchers soaked through with roast drippings. The day's journey across centuries of strange and scrappy food fades like a candle down to its last flicker. Outside, the wind sighs against the shutters, and you imagine the world beyond the enslaving two, fields resting in the moonlight, kitchens dark, fires banked. Somewhere, a baker is rising before dawn. Somewhere, a pot is simmering slowly, ready for another day of doing the best you can with what you've got. And you, well, you've done quite enough for tonight. Let your breath slow, your eyes close. Let the noise and spice and surprise of the medieval table drift into dreams. You've walked the dusty lanes, you've nibbled the eel, you've watched cooks argue over stew like philosophers debating truth. Now, sleep. Sleep like a weary traveler in a warm bed above a noisy inn. Let the softness of blankets replace the scratch of sackcloth, the gentle hum of the night taking over from clanging spoons and snapping fires. You've eaten well, historically speaking, and you've earned a long rest. So hush now. The journey's over. And tomorrow, maybe, we'll talk about how medieval people brush their teeth. or didn't. Thanks for sticking with me through this strange and sleepy journey into the world of medieval junk food. From frog pies and hedgehog roasts to trenchers, turnip stew, and eel debates, we saw just how creative and occasionally questionable diets could get when survival met imagination. If you enjoyed this cozy little time travel into the past, let me know by hitting that like button. And if you haven't already, subscribe for more sleepy deep dives into the weird, boring, and wonderful corners of history. I'd love to hear from you. Drop your current time and location in the comments and tell me, which medieval snack would you maybe try, and which one would you politely decline forever? Until next time, stay curious, stay cozy, and never trust a meat pie that's still moving. Sleep well. Good night, sweet dreams.